I stood at the front of the packed funeral hall, my fingers gripping the edges of the polished wooden podium so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The scent of lilies and roses choked the air, blending with the heavy perfume of mourners who had come to pay their respects. Bianca's coffin lay before me, draped in white, an illusion of purity that mocked me even in death. I had rehearsed my words 1,000 times, yet now, as I stared at the sea of familiar and unfamiliar faces, I felt an eerie calm settle over me. I wasn't here to grieve. I was here to end the charade. The priest had barely begun his final blessings when the silence shattered. All this money is mine by right. I'm taking back what's mine. The voice rang out, slicing through the somber atmosphere like a blade through flesh. Gasps echoed from every corner of the hall, heads snapping toward the source of the outburst. And there he stood, the man I had always suspected but never confronted, Dominic. Dressed in a sleek black suit, his salt and pepper hair perfectly styled, he didn't look like a grieving friend or a quiet mourner. No, he stood there with a confidence that disgusted me, his lips curled into the slightest smirk. He didn't care about the solemnity of the moment. He was here for what he thought was rightfully his. The room buzzed with whispers. Bianca's family, seated in the front row, turned in horror, their faces twisted with shock and confusion. Marcus, my son, no, her son, stared at the man with a mixture of disbelief and something I couldn't quite place. Hurt? Recognition? I swallowed the bile rising in my throat. Dominic took a step forward, his polished dress shoes clicking against the marble floor. She didn't love you, Jonathan, he said, his voice dripping with arrogance. She loved me. He let the words hang in the air, savoring the reaction of the stunned crowd. She was only with you because it was convenient, because you could give her the life she deserved. A tremor of rage ran through my veins, but I didn't move. Not yet. I had waited too long for this moment, planned too carefully to let emotion get in the way. Instead, I studied him, watching the way he puffed out his chest like a peacock displaying its feathers. He thought he had already won. Then he did the unthinkable. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a stack of papers, waving them dramatically for all to see. This, he declared, his voice rising with each word, is proof that Bianca left everything to me. The house, the assets, the company, all of it. Not to you, Jonathan. Not even to her son. To me. The room collectively inhaled. Someone in the back murmured, "This has to be a joke." Bianca's mother, an aging woman in a deep navy dress, clutched her chest as if the weight of her daughter's betrayal had physically struck her. Her father, normally a stoic man, stared at the papers with a look of disbelief that quickly darkened into something else, anger. I let the silence stretch, let the tension coil tighter and tighter until it was ready to snap. Then, finally, I spoke. "You think you've won?" I said, my voice even controlled. I reached into my own jacket, my fingers brushing against the documents I had carried for this very moment. "You think Bianca played everyone in this room, that she got exactly what she wanted and left you the spoils?" Dominic scoffed. "That's exactly what happened." A small, humorless smile tugged at the corner of my lips. "Then let's talk about the truth." I pulled out my own stack of papers, crisp, damning, and final. And just like that, the color drained from Dominic's face. I stepped forward, my footsteps slow and deliberate, letting the weight of the moment settle over the room. The papers in my hands felt heavier than they should have, as if they carried the gravity of every lie, every deception, every betrayal Bianca had spun in her carefully crafted web. The silence was suffocating. All eyes were on me now, waiting, desperate for the truth even if they didn't know it yet. Dominic's arrogance wavered for the first time as he watched me unfold the documents. His fingers twitched, his grip on his so-called proof tightening. He had walked in here believing he was the victor, but he had made a critical mistake. He underestimated me. I took my time, my gaze sweeping across the room. Bianca's family, their faces frozen in disbelief. Marcus, his hands balled into fists at his sides, confusion swimming in his eyes. And Dominic, standing there like a king about to be dethroned. I turned to face him directly. "You claim Bianca loved you," I said, my voice smooth, unwavering. "That she left everything to you." Dominic straightened, his smugness flickering back to life. Because she did. A chuckle escaped my lips, dark and knowing. Then tell me something, I said, holding up the first page. If Bianca trusted you so much, if she wanted you to have everything, why did she go behind your back and do this? I flicked the paper toward the closest table, letting it land face up. Dominic hesitated, then snatched it up with a confident smirk. The smirk lasted all of 2 seconds before his entire expression crumbled. He tried to mask it, but I saw it, the tightening of his jaw, the pulse in his neck jumping wildly, the way his fingers curled slightly inward as if he wanted to crush the evidence in his hands. The guests leaned in, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever had rattled him so badly. He wet his lips, swallowed hard. "This is fake," he muttered, but his voice lacked its former bravado. "Is it?" I asked, stepping even closer, invading the space he thought belonged to him. "You recognize it, don't you? Bianca's signature, notarized, official. It's a revision to her will, one she made only 2 weeks before she died. And do you know what it says, Dominic?" His lips parted, but no sound came out. I answered for him. "It says you get nothing." The collective gasp was deafening. Dominic's entire body jerked forward, his confidence shattered. "You're lying." "Am I?" I reached for the second document, flipping it open with the same deliberate care. "Then maybe you can explain this, a financial record of every wire transfer Bianca ever made to you. Tens of thousands of dollars, siphoned from accounts she told me were for our son's future. I assume you thought I'd never find them." Dominic's throat bobbed as he took a step back. I wasn't finished. "And this one," I continued, holding up the third page, "is the kicker. A legal affidavit, signed by Bianca herself, stating that you—" I let the words hang for a moment, savoring the tension, the raw anticipation in the air. Then I drove the final nail in his coffin. "Are not Marcus's father." A stunned silence fell over the room. The guests looked at each other, bewildered, their eyes darting between me and Dominic. Even Bianca's mother, who had spent years defending her daughter's perfect life, was now trembling, clutching her pearls as if they were the only thing keeping her from collapsing. Marcus, who had been standing rigidly to the side, took an unconscious step forward. "What?" he whispered. I turned to him now, my voice softer. "She lied to everyone, son. To me. To you. To him." I motioned toward Dominic, whose entire world was crumbling before him. "She spent her life playing us all like pieces on a chessboard." Marcus's breath hitched. He looked at Dominic, then back at me. "Then, who is my father?" Dominic's expression twisted into something ugly. "This is a trick." His voice rose, panicked. "She would never do this to me." "She already did." I stepped back, my work nearly complete. "You just never saw it coming." The color drained from Dominic's face. And then, the whispers began. The murmurs spread like wildfire, hissing through the funeral hall, bouncing from one shocked face to another. Bianca's betrayal wasn't just mine to bear anymore. It belonged to all of them now. Dominic was frozen, his face draining of color as the weight of the truth bore down on him. His once confident stance had crumbled. His fingers twitched like he wanted to rip the papers apart, erase the words staring back at him. But there was no escaping it. The air was thick with judgment, the room no longer his audience but his jury. Then, Marcus spoke. "You're lying," he said, though his voice wavered. His eyes darted between me and Dominic, panic creeping in, his reality slipping through his fingers. "You have to be lying." I turned to him. "My son? No, Bianca's son." The pain in his voice cut deeper than I expected. "I wish I were," I said, my tone softer now. "I wish none of this was true." But she made sure it was. His hands curled into fists. "She told me," his voice broke, his breath uneven. "She told me you weren't my father. That you never wanted me. That Dominic." I exhaled slowly, steadying myself. "She lied to you, Marcus." The words landed like a physical blow. He flinched. His whole life, his entire identity, was unraveling in front of him. Dominic finally snapped out of his shock, desperation leaking into his features. "This is garbage," he bellowed, shaking the papers in his hand. "She told me," he cut himself off, his nostrils flaring as he turned on me, jabbing a finger in my face. "You think you can just waltz in here and rewrite history?" That I'll let you humiliate me in front of everyone. I didn't flinch. I didn't move. I didn't rewrite history, Dominic, I said, my voice cold, deliberate. Bianca did. I'm just making sure everyone sees it. He let out a strangled laugh, shaking his head. This isn't real. He spun to Marcus, wild-eyed. You know me. You know she loved me. Marcus took a step back. It was over. Dominic realized it at the same moment I did. The air around him shifted, the power draining from his stance. No one in this room would stand behind him now. No one would believe him over cold, hard proof. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, but he had nothing left. The final, cruelest irony of all? Bianca had done to him what she had done to me. Used him, lied to him, discarded him when he was no longer useful. I let the silence stretch, let him feel it. Then, I twisted the knife. She didn't love anyone, Dominic. Not me. Not you. I met his panicked gaze, unblinking. She loved control. And now? She has none. His breath hitched, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his own stupidity. That was when the first person walked out. Then another. And another. A ripple effect, people rising from their seats, shaking their heads, whispering to each other as they filed toward the doors. Bianca's family, her so-called friends, even her business partners, none of them wanted to be associated with this mess. The funeral was no longer about grieving a lost woman. It was about burying her lies. Dominic was still standing there, his chest heaving, his hands trembling. I leaned in slightly, lowering my voice just enough so that only he could hear. She played us both, I murmured. The difference is, I learned from it. And with that, I turned on my heel and walked away, leaving him alone. I walked slowly down the aisle of the funeral hall, the murmurs and whispers trailing behind me like the ghost of Bianca herself. The air felt different now, thicker, heavier, like the very walls of this place could no longer hold the weight of the truth I had just unleashed. Dominic stood frozen at the front of the room, his hands clenched into trembling fists, his once perfect posture now hunched with humiliation. He had come here expecting to claim his prize, to gloat, to revel in his imagined victory. Instead, he had been stripped bare in front of everyone who had ever mattered to Bianca, exposed as nothing more than a fool who had believed in a woman who never truly cared for him. Just like I had once believed. The difference was, I had prepared for this moment. He hadn't. I reached the back of the room, near the grand oak doors, when I felt a presence beside me. I turned slightly and met Marcus's wide, tear-glossed eyes. He looked lost, broken. His whole world had just been turned upside down. Did she ever love me? His voice was barely above a whisper, like he was afraid of the answer. I swallowed the lump in my throat, my jaw tightening. This was the part that hurt the most. The part one had no perfect answer for. She was your mother, I said, keeping my voice steady. And in her own way. I think she did. But Bianca didn't love the way normal people do. She loved things. Power. Control. Image. I hesitated, watching his face twist in pain. She saw you as a part of that. As something to be shaped, molded into a reflection of her. Marcus exhaled sharply, rubbing his hands over his face. I don't even know who I am anymore. I nodded, understanding that feeling all too well. Then maybe it's time to figure that out. For yourself. Not for her. Not for me. Not for anyone else. His shoulders slumped, but there was something different in his expression now. A flicker of something deeper, anger, betrayal, maybe even relief. Then a voice cut through the tension, sharp and venomous. You think you can just walk away from this? Dominic. I turned back to see him storming toward me, his face flushed with rage, his hands still clutching those useless, worthless papers as if they meant something now. You think this is over? He hissed, stopping just inches from my face. His breath reeked of desperation. You humiliated me in front of everyone. You ruined me. I let a beat of silence pass, then tilted my head slightly. No, Dominic, I said, my voice calm. You ruined yourself. I just let everyone see it. His lips curled into a sneer. You think I'm just going to let you walk away? That I'll just accept this? He took a step closer, lowering his voice so only I could hear. You don't know what I'm capable of, Jonathan. I held his gaze, unfazed. And you didn't know what I was capable of, I said smoothly. That's why you lost. He inhaled sharply, nostrils flaring, but he didn't move. He wouldn't do anything. Not here. Not now. His power was gone. Then Bianca's father spoke from the front of the room. Get out, Dominic. The entire room went silent. Dominic turned, eyes darting toward the old man standing beside Bianca's closed casket. His face, usually so reserved, was cold with disgust. This funeral isn't for you, he said, his voice laced with steel. You're not welcome here. You never were. Dominic's mouth opened, then closed. He glanced around the room, as if searching for someone, anyone, to take his side. But there was no one left. The people who had once admired him, who had laughed at his jokes, who had thought of him as Bianca's trusted confidant, they were all looking at him now with nothing but disdain. He was alone. Completely, utterly alone. A muscle jumped in his jaw, his hands curling into fists at his sides. But he knew there was nothing left to say. With a sharp exhale, he turned on his heel and stormed toward the doors, shoving past mourners without a second glance. His footsteps echoed in the silent hall until the doors swung open, then shut behind him with a final, resounding boom. And just like that, Dominic was gone. I let out a slow breath. It was over. But as I turned back to Bianca's casket, staring at the polished wood that now held nothing more than the remnants of a life built on lies, I realized something. For her, it was over. For the rest of us, it was just beginning. The doors slammed shut behind Dominic, leaving nothing but a hollow silence in his wake. The air inside the funeral hall was thick with the weight of everything that had just unraveled, secrets exposed, illusions shattered, reputations destroyed. People shifted awkwardly in their seats, whispering among themselves, exchanging glances that carried unspoken thoughts. No one had expected this. I turned my gaze toward Bianca's casket. It sat there, cold, lifeless, just like the woman inside had been long before she took her last breath. The truth about her had finally surfaced, laid bare for everyone to see. Yet, standing here now, surrounded by her mourners, people who had once adored her, envied her, even idolized her, I felt none of the satisfaction I thought I would. Marcus was still standing beside me, his breathing uneven. His entire body was tense, locked in place, his mind no doubt racing through every memory, every lie, every whispered word his mother had ever told him. I knew what that felt like. I reached out, hesitating for only a moment before resting a firm hand on his shoulder. He flinched slightly but didn't pull away. Marcus, I said, my voice steady. We should talk. His jaw tightened. About what? You already know, I answered. About what comes next. His eyes darkened, and for a split second, I saw the same restrained fury burning behind them that I had felt in myself for years. The same feeling that had kept me awake at night, replaying the past, searching for answers I was never meant to find. He swallowed hard, his voice quieter now. I don't even know what's real anymore. I nodded. I get that. He turned to me then, his expression raw, vulnerable. Was she always like this? He asked. Did you always know? I took a slow breath, choosing my words carefully. I suspected. I just didn't want to believe it. Why not? I let out a short, humorless chuckle. Because when you love someone, when you've built a life around them, the truth is the last thing you want to see. He clenched his jaw, his fingers twitching at his sides. She told me you were the bad guy, he muttered. That you didn't care about me. That you only stayed because of the company, the money. I exhaled sharply, the familiar sting of betrayal creeping back in. She needed you to believe that. Because if you had started questioning her, if you had started seeing her for what she really was, she wouldn't have been able to control you anymore. Marcus stared at me for a long moment, his breathing shallow. Then, slowly, his gaze flickered back toward Bianca's casket. I watched the emotions play across his face, anger, sadness, regret. But there was something else, too. Clarity. He was beginning to understand. Before I could say anything else, Bianca's father suddenly cleared his throat from the front of the room. Jonathan, he called out, his voice still carrying the authority of a man who had spent his life commanding a boardroom. A word. I exchanged a quick glance with Marcus, then nodded. Stay here, I told him, before striding forward to meet the man who had once been my father-in-law. He waited until I was close enough before speaking, his expression unreadable. "You had all of that planned, didn't you?" I met his gaze evenly. "Yes." He exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "I should be furious with you," he muttered. "But the truth is, I'm more furious with her." His voice dipped lower, almost as if he didn't want the others to hear. I knew Bianca was ambitious. I knew she had a manipulative side. But I never thought she would do this. Lying to all of us. Using you. Using Marcus. His hands curled into fists at his sides. I spent my entire life building something for her. And now I find out she never even gave a damn about her own family. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. After a long moment, he looked back up at me. "What are your intentions now?" I studied him carefully. "What do you mean?" He narrowed his eyes slightly. "You just turned my daughter's funeral into a courtroom. You exposed everything in front of everyone. Bianca's legacy, her reputation, it's all gone. That can't have been the end of it. You've got something else planned, don't you?" I didn't answer right away. Because he was right. This wasn't the end. Bianca's death had only closed one chapter. There was still unfinished business, and I intended to handle it. I met his gaze, letting the silence stretch between us. Bianca's father, once a pillar of strength in the business world, now just an old man drowning in the wreckage of his daughter's deceit, was waiting for an answer. I could see the conflict in his eyes. He hated what I had done today, the spectacle I had made of this funeral. But deep down, he knew I was right. Bianca had built her life on a foundation of lies, and I had simply knocked out the final brick. "What comes next is up to you," I finally said, keeping my voice even. "You can keep pretending Bianca was the woman you wanted her to be, or you can face the reality of what she really was." His lips pressed into a thin line. "And you? What do you intend to do?" I glanced toward the casket, exhaling slowly. "Finish what she started." His frown deepened. "What does that mean?" I stepped in closer, lowering my voice. "Bianca didn't just betray me. She betrayed you, your company, your legacy. You think I don't know what she and Dominic were planning?" I let the words sink in, watching the flicker of realization flash in his eyes. She was moving assets. Slowly, subtly, testing how much she could get away with before shifting full control over to him. His jaw clenched. "You have proof." I pulled a folded document from my jacket and pressed it into his palm. "See for yourself." He unfolded it carefully, scanning the contents. I didn't need to read it again. I had spent months gathering every last piece of Bianca's financial treachery, tracing each transfer, every missing dollar. She had been siphoning money out of the company under the guise of investments, shifting power piece by piece to Dominic. She hadn't just been preparing to leave me, she had been preparing to take the company out from under her own father, cutting him out of the picture entirely. His grip on the paper tightened, his face darkening with fury. That witch. I didn't correct him. His breathing was ragged now, his mind likely racing back through years of decisions, trying to spot the moments where Bianca had played him for a fool. I had lived that same torment for months, reliving every conversation, every smile, every moment of false affection, seeing it all through new eyes. "What do you want from me?" he finally asked, his voice hoarse. I gave him a knowing look. "You already know the answer to that." His expression hardened. He was a businessman, above all else. And businessmen didn't waste time on emotions, they focused on the bottom line. Bianca had spent years positioning Dominic to take control. But with her gone and Dominic publicly disgraced, the company was vulnerable. Bianca's father had two choices: try to salvage the mess she had left behind, or trust someone who had been by his side all along. Someone who had spent years believing he was building an empire for his family, only to realize he had been funding his own betrayal. "You want control," he said, his voice measured. "I want what's mine," I corrected. "The life I built. The company I helped expand." The power Bianca was so eager to throw away on a man who never deserved it. I tilted my head slightly. "Or, if you'd rather let the board vote for new leadership, I'm happy to let the scandal of today's events dictate their decision." His eyes darkened. "You wouldn't." I arched a brow. "Wouldn't I?" "I wasn't here to negotiate." Bianca had spent her life manipulating and controlling everyone around her, twisting the board, shaping public perception, making sure she always came out on top. She had played the game well, but I had learned to play it better. He let out a slow breath, rubbing a hand over his face. "You're a cold bastard, Jonathan." I allowed myself the smallest smirk. I learned from the best. The silence between us stretched. Then, finally, he nodded. "Fine." One word. That was all I needed. Bianca had spent her life planning for a future that never came. Now, I would take everything she had left behind. The power, the company, and most importantly, the control. The deal was struck. No need for contracts, no formal negotiations, just a nod between two men who had both been played by the same woman. Bianca had spent years orchestrating her perfect future, one where she could have everything and control everyone. But in the end, she had lost. And now, I was the one holding all the cards. As Bianca's father turned away, gripping the documents tighter in his hands, I watched the weight of realization settle over him. He had raised a daughter who saw love as leverage, loyalty as weakness, and power as her only currency. And now, that legacy of deception had brought him to this moment, where the man he had once dismissed as nothing more than his daughter's convenient husband was now his only option. I wasn't naive. I knew this wasn't about trust. It never had been. This was about survival. As I made my way back down the aisle, the atmosphere in the funeral hall was thick with something else now, uncertainty. The crowd had thinned, many of Bianca's so-called friends already slipping out the doors, eager to distance themselves from the scandal that had just unfolded. The few who remained sat stiffly in their seats, whispering behind gloved hands, casting wary glances in my direction. I spotted Marcus standing near the far wall, his hands shoved into his pockets, his expression unreadable. He had every right to hate me, every right to lash out. I had just torn down the only truth he had ever known and left him standing in the wreckage. But when our eyes met, there was no hatred there, just questions. And that was what I had been waiting for. I approached him slowly, giving him space, waiting to see if he would speak first. He did. "What happens now?" His voice was quieter than before, but steadier. I studied him for a moment, taking in the way his shoulders tensed, the way his hands curled slightly at his sides. He was angry, but not at me. He was angry at the ghost of his mother, at the years of lies she had fed him, at the realization that he had been nothing more than a pawn in her long game. "That depends on you," I said finally. His brow furrowed. "On me. You're at a crossroads, Marcus," I told him. "You can let this break you. Let it turn you into the kind of man Bianca would have wanted, angry, bitter, blind to the truth. Or you can take control of your own life. Make your own choices. Decide who you really want to be." His jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought he might snap back, push me away like I was just another manipulator trying to shape his future. But then he exhaled, long and slow, running a hand through his dark hair. "You think you know everything, don't you?" he muttered, shaking his head. I let out a short breath, almost amused. "No, but I do know what it's like to have your entire life ripped out from under you." His eyes flickered to mine, searching. "And what did you do?" I held his gaze. I stopped being the victim. A long silence stretched between us. Then, to my surprise, a small, bitter smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. "So that's what this is?" he asked. "You taking back control?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. He nodded slowly, as if piecing everything together. Then, after another long pause, he said, "She really thought she could control all of us, huh?" "She did control us," I corrected. "Until now." He swallowed hard, looking down at his shoes, then back up at me. "You're not my father," he said, and for the first time, there was no accusation in his voice. Just truth. Acceptance. "No," I agreed. "But I'm the only one still here." Another pause. Then, finally, Marcus gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't trust. But it was the first step. And for now, that was enough. The funeral had become something else entirely, a battlefield where Bianca's lies had finally been unearthed and her carefully curated legacy had crumbled under the weight of the truth. But the war wasn't over. Not yet. As Marcus and I stood there, the last remnants of the guests slowly filing out, I could feel the shift in the air. This wasn't just the end of Bianca's story. It was the beginning of something else. Marcus shoved his hands into his pockets, staring at the floor. So, what now? His voice was quieter now, less defiant, but still edged with the anger he wasn't sure where to direct. I glanced at him. That depends on what you want. He scoffed, shaking his head. What I want? I wanted a mother who didn't lie to me my whole life. I wanted to believe I knew who the hell I was. But I don't get that, do I? His voice cracked, just slightly, but he forced himself to keep standing tall. I didn't answer right away. I let him sit in it, let him feel the weight of everything that had just happened. Then, finally, I said, no, you don't. But what you do get is the truth, whether you like it or not. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. And what am I supposed to do with that? I let out a slow breath, scanning the near-empty room. You can start by deciding whose mess you want to clean up, yours or hers. He frowned, confused. What the hell does that mean? It means, I said, stepping closer, lowering my voice, Bianca left a disaster behind, and someone's going to have to deal with it. He tilted his head slightly, searching my expression. You. I smirked. I already have a plan. But you. I studied him carefully. You need to decide if you want to be a part of this or keep pretending none of it ever happened. His jaw tensed. What if I don't want to be part of any of this? Then you walk away, I said simply. No one's forcing you to do anything. But you need to understand something, Marcus. This isn't just about Bianca. The company, the money, the legacy she thought she was protecting, it's still out there. And now, everyone who had their hands in her pockets is scrambling to figure out their next move. I could see the realization creeping in. Bianca hadn't just lied to us. She had played everyone. Every investor, every board member, every partner who had ever believed she was some kind of financial genius. But now that she was gone, the foundation she had built was cracking. And in the chaos, there would be opportunities. Marcus ran a hand down his face, exhaling hard. I don't know if I can do this, he muttered. I met his gaze. Then decide if you want to be the guy people pity or the one they fear. His eyes flickered. That was the moment I knew I had him. He wasn't ready to admit it yet, but the anger in his chest, the betrayal simmering beneath his skin, it wasn't going away. It would fester, grow, sharpen into something else. Something useful. Come with me, I said, turning toward the door. He hesitated. Then, after a long moment, he followed. The funeral was over. Now, it was time to take everything Bianca left behind. The black sedan pulled away from the funeral home, the tires humming against the pavement as I drove in silence. Marcus sat in the passenger seat, his face turned toward the window, his expression blank, but I could see the tension in his jaw. He was thinking, processing. Good. Because what came next would require his full attention. We didn't speak for the first few miles. The city blurred past in streaks of gray and gold as the afternoon sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the skyline. I could feel the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on him, but I wasn't about to hold his hand through this. If he wanted answers, he would have to ask the right questions. Finally, after another long stretch of silence, he exhaled sharply. Where are we going? I kept my eyes on the road. To see exactly how deep your mother's lies ran. His head snapped toward me. What does that mean? I smirked slightly. You thought today was bad? I glanced at him briefly before returning my focus to the road. Bianca was preparing for something big, Marcus. The funeral was just the first piece. There's more. A lot more. He scoffed, shaking his head. Jesus. Of course, there is. I didn't respond. I pulled into an underground parking garage, the fluorescent lights casting everything in a cold, sterile glow. The sound of the tires echoed in the empty space as I maneuvered into a reserved spot near the elevator. Marcus frowned. Where the hell are we? I shifted into park and turned off the engine. My office. He gave me a skeptical look. Since when do you have an office here? Since I stopped letting people lie to me. I pushed open the door, stepping out without waiting for him. He hesitated for a moment, but curiosity won out, and soon enough, I heard his footsteps following me toward the elevator. The ride up was silent, tense. He shifted slightly, glancing at me like he wanted to ask something but wasn't sure if he should. I gave him nothing. The elevator doors slid open to reveal a sleek, minimalist space, black leather chairs, dark wooden desks, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. A few employees glanced up as I walked past, nodding in acknowledgement before returning to their work. Marcus looked around, clearly trying to piece things together. "I thought you were an architect." I smirked. "I am. But I also plan ahead." I led him down a hallway and into a private office, closing the door behind us. Inside, a large monitor sat on the desk, several stacks of files neatly arranged beside it. I walked over to the desk, tapped a few keys, and brought up a screen filled with spreadsheets, transaction logs, and legal documents. Marcus stepped closer, I scanning the data. Then he froze. His voice was barely above a whisper. "What the hell is this?" I leaned against the desk, crossing my arms. "Your mother's empire. Or what's left of it." He swallowed hard, eyes darting across the screen. This is everything, isn't it?" I nodded. "Every account, every offshore transfer, every deal she ever made in secret." I reached for a thick folder and tossed it onto the desk in front of him. And most importantly, every piece of evidence tying her financial movements back to Dominic. His breath hitched. He flipped open the folder, his fingers shaking slightly as he skimmed the pages. "She was cutting everyone out," I said, watching him closely. "Not just me. Not just you. She was even setting Dominic up to take the fall if things went south." Marcus clenched his jaw, gripping the edges of the folder so tightly his knuckles turned white. "She never planned to share any of it," I continued. "Not the company. Not the money. Not even the legacy she was so obsessed with protecting. She was always going to be the one holding the strings. Everyone else? We were just insurance policies." He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Unbelievable. Believe it." A long silence stretched between us. Then, slowly, Marcus closed the folder, exhaling sharply. "So," he said, his voice steadier now, "what do we do with all of this?" I smiled. "Now, I thought, you're asking the right questions." I reached for another folder, thinner, but far more important. "We take control." I slid it across the desk toward him. "And we start by making sure Dominic never gets back up again." Marcus stared at the folder in front of him, his fingers twitching slightly before he reached for it. He flipped it open, his eyes scanning the contents. I could see the tension in his face shift, confusion, then realization, then something sharper, something darker. Inside was a collection of documents that, if played correctly, would obliterate Dominic. Emails, bank transfers, fake invoices, evidence of backdoor deals Bianca had orchestrated, all funneling money into Dominic's pockets while setting him up as the fall guy. Marcus's breath hitched as he turned another page. "This," he shook his head. "This is bad. Very bad." I agreed, leaning back in my chair. "Your mother was smart. She kept everything close, never leaving a clear trail. But she wasn't perfect. She got sloppy when she started making moves too quickly. And that's where I started digging." Marcus's grip tightened on the paper. "So what? We just hand this over to the police?" I smirked. "If we were feeling merciful, maybe. But we're not." His brows furrowed. "Then what's the plan?" I leaned forward, tapping my fingers against the desk. Dominic thought today was his worst nightmare. He was wrong. You see, when a man like him loses, he doesn't disappear. He scrambles. He begs. He cuts deals. He tries to claw his way back into power. I gestured toward the documents. "But this makes sure he never gets back up." Marcus exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "I still don't get it. Why not just expose him outright?" "Because that would be too easy," I said, my voice smooth. "Dominic is arrogant. He still thinks he has moves left. And if we go to the authorities now, he'll just find a way to wiggle out. He'll stall. He'll play the victim. He'll drag this out for years." I gave him a knowing look. "But if we let him think he has a way out, if we give him just enough rope, he'll hang himself." A pause. Then, slowly, Marcus sat back, his expression shifting. He was starting to understand. You want to let him think he's winning, he murmured. Exactly. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the desk. He's desperate now? He just lost Bianca, the money, the company, and his reputation. He's going to come looking for a way to fix this. And when he does, we'll be waiting. Marcus's jaw clenched. He flipped through a few more pages, then exhaled sharply. How do we do it? I smiled. Simple, I said. We let him dig his own grave. The next day, I made the first move. A single email. It was anonymous, untraceable, perfectly crafted. A message sent to a very specific person, one of Dominic's closest business contacts, someone just shady enough to be useful, but greedy enough to betray him when the time was right. The message was simple. Dominic's in trouble, but there's a way out. Meet me. Let's talk. Attached was a file. Just one document. One carefully selected piece of Bianca's financial dealings that tied Dominic to something problematic. Not enough to bury him. Just enough to scare him. Enough to make him desperate. And desperate men? They made mistakes. Now, all I had to do was wait. I didn't have to wait long. By midday, my burner phone buzzed with a single message. Who are you? What do you want? I smirked. That didn't take much, did it? Dominic was already scrambling. The walls were closing in, and he knew it. I typed back a response, short and to the point. I know what Bianca was planning. I know what you were planning. But I also know how to fix this for a price. The bait was set. Now, all I had to do was let him bite. 2 hours later, I was sitting in a dimly lit bar, my fingers wrapped around a glass of whiskey as I waited. The place was quiet, the kind of spot where no one asked questions, where deals were made in hushed voices over top-shelf liquor. Then, the door swung open. Dominic walked in. His usual arrogance was gone. His suit, while still expensive, looked slightly disheveled, his tie loosened, his eyes darting around like a man expecting an ambush. He had always prided himself on control, but now? He was just another cornered rat looking for a way out. Good. He spotted me and stalked over, dropping into the seat across from me without a word. Talk, he snapped. What do you know? I took a slow sip of my drink, savoring the moment. More than you think. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. Look, if this is about Bianca's money. I laughed, shaking my head. Dominic, you're missing the bigger picture. This isn't just about money. It's about power. And right now, you don't have any. His jaw clenched. You think you do? I leaned forward, lowering my voice. I know I do. I tapped the folder sitting on the table between us. And after you read this, so will you. He hesitated, then snatched up the folder, flipping it open. His eyes scanned the pages, his expression darkening with every second. Where did you get this? He muttered. I smirked. Let's just say Bianca wasn't as careful as she thought she was. His breath hitched. I could see the calculations running through his head, the desperate need to find a way out. You're giving me this, he said, his voice slow, testing. Why? I sat back, shrugging. Because I don't care about revenge. I care about control. And right now, the company is in chaos. The board is looking for stability, for someone who can step in and fix this mess. I gave him a pointed look. And that's not you. His nostrils flared. You want me to walk away? I nodded. Quietly. No lawsuits, no claims, no more pathetic attempts to fight for something that was never yours to begin with. You disappear, and in exchange, I don't release this. I tapped the folder. Because trust me, Dominic, once this hits the right hands, you won't just be broke. You'll be in prison. Silence. He gripped the folder tighter, his knuckles going white. He wanted to fight. I could see it in his eyes. But he knew he couldn't. Finally, he let out a shaky breath. And if I say no? He asked. I smiled coldly. Then you won't like what happens next. Another pause. Then, with a quiet curse under his breath, he shoved the folder back across the table and stood. You think you've won, he muttered, shaking his head. But Bianca always said. I cut him off. Bianca's gone. I met his gaze, unblinking. And I'm still here. His throat bobbed. He had no more cards left to play. Without another word, he turned and walked out. I watched him go, waited until the door swung shut behind him. Then, I pulled out my phone and sent a single message. It's done. He's out. We move forward. A few seconds later, a response came through. Understood. We're ready. I let out a slow breath, setting my phone down. Bianca had spent her whole life playing the game. Now, it belonged to me.